From VoteDixon.com, this is the blog post, Whitehall Ward 1 Councilman Chris Rodriguez, a revealing indictment of his official record. Read by the author, Gerald Dixon. Part 2, the critical summary. Let me say first to those supporters of Mr. Rodriguez, I have always found Mr. Rodriguez polite and affable. By face value, he seems a nice enough man. But this is not a nice man contest. It is about claiming a seat as the citizens' representative on council that will act as a watchdog and proponent of the people they serve, to independently serve the interests of the citizens he represents within the offices of Whitehall City Council, that branch which is separate in our government from the other two for a reason. As a human being and my mother's son, I take no enjoyment or satisfaction from having to write this post. It is one of those things which are part of the process in elections. I am running and need to make my case to you. Not only why I'm the better candidate, but alternately why he is not. If his record had been better, he wouldn't have provided me himself with the ammunition he has. But that's not the case. That is on him. The question remains then, who will do a better job in that capacity? In that, and being that Mr. Rodriguez has a record to analyze, it is only fitting that it be scrutinized. And, like Mr. Rodriguez back in 2001, I also come to you without a record, making my case as to how and why I would do a better job as your representative in your local government than he. That being said then, it is my claim that Mr. Rodriguez, from the public record and from observing him for several years, has been a seat filler rather than a leader all these years, since the first year of the first term of the George W. Bush administration. It is evident in his disregard for the principle that you should show up and work for what you're being paid for, that which he ignored for his own benefit, and the rest of council, who excused all his absences, ignored for various reasons. Never did it seem the time that he or them considered that Mr. Rodriguez should resign, with no judgments, if he's unable, for whatever reason, to carry out the responsibilities fully that the citizens entrusted him to, nor consider the citizens at all in that regard. What was more important to him was his own standing, keeping his weak leadership on the handle of power and keeping that steady income flowing. That is wrong. Let me state that again. That is wrong. Morally and financially wrong to the taxpayers, citizens he represents. And yet, what else is one to think of the moral failings of a person who would ask you to continue supporting him in light of that behavior? It is evident in his lackluster leadership. Where are the programs or ideas or innovation for the neighborhoods he's represented? I've seen none. Where was his voice for the citizens he represents when I shouted out that the city was abusing their power in regard to citizens' civil rights, specifically the 4th and 14th Amendment? The only voice I heard was mine, not his. I stood up and showed up for the people, and I wasn't even being paid to do so. He who was, did not. He has had an inordinate amount of time to prove his leadership outside of occupying a chair and collecting a check. And yet, per the record, his most spectacular achievement to date has been to show up the least of any councilperson in the last 16 years. This is followed by his unending agreement to everything everyone else comes up with, and the sad showing of his time as the people's legislator, introducing little to nothing on his own. Period. Finally, it is evident in his disregard for the public he represents by disrespecting their overwhelming support of term limits 3 times. Because Mr. Rodriguez and his ilk's obsession remains compelled to always have their hands on the throttle of power here in Whitehall, while disregarding and thus disrespecting voters' wishes in favor of term limits, they're able to injudiciously hop from office to office, circumventing those citizens' mandate. They don't really care what you want. They're not really in it for you, and so, the evident ones keep doing what they must in order to stay in power. including, quite frankly, those who ignore what's right for the citizens in favor of continuously supporting such behavior and actions. There is much to show in regard for Mr. Rodriguez's contempt for the people he claims to quote-unquote serve and continue to, but this particular one is vital to see the unadorned truth of the matter. Here, again, is his remark to a reporter after term limits were again reinforced by the voters in 2013. Quote, "This is the third time it's gone down. The people want them kept in place, and we have to respect that," said Councilman Chris Rodriguez, who was reelected to his fourth term. "We had 3 races go unopposed, mine being one of them." End quote. A few additional arguments to make my case that he should not be reelected to yet another term. He claims in the paper that now is not the time to change councilpersons. I would agree if his time on council had actually been spent pursuing and exhibiting strong, independent leadership with critical thinking skills and proactively pursuing projects with creativity and innovation to shape those neighborhoods he represented with something more tangible and effective to show for, instead of just merely nodding his head yes all the time. But, per the record, he didn't. He merely filled the seat, collected a paycheck he too often didn't earn with his heavy absences, and said yes to most everything that was set in front of him, good and bad, no doubt due to a lack of imagination, interest, creativity, and or depth of deeper knowledge of things like sociology and city planning. Others, who perhaps understood these things better, presented their cases to him and the others, and that was good enough for him. It really, though, is not good enough for a council representative who should use critical thinking skills, in particular, for the best outcomes for his constituents. As well, if Mr. Rodriguez is so invaluable to the workings of outcomes at City Hall, as his comment implies, then he must lay claim to the worst this city has seen as well. If he is supposedly indispensable to the workings of council and city governance in Whitehall, and therefore partly responsible for any current success it's enjoying, then its wretched dive into trouble and despair must also be his to claim. He was on council 7 years by the time the worst dip of the economic crisis hit in January of 2009, and so must also claim all the wretched, sagging blight and crime that had entrenched itself in Whitehall during his first 2 terms as Ward 1 councilman. He's been in there long enough that if he can lay claim to successes, then we must blame him too for its failings. However, this is all nonsense. Mr. Rodriguez has no more claim to Whitehall's successes and failures than Donald Trump has to class or nuance. To claim so is to ignore the truth of his record, that successes and failures have little relationship to non-leaders like Chris Rodriguez, and more to both socio-economic waves and people who are more present and engaged than Councilman Rodriguez was, is, or ever will be. Plain and simply. As well, I believe the reason he has been kept in so long was that he made no stinks or ripples. He is the classic job filler who merely keeps any opinion or dynamism under the radar so that he gives nothing for anyone in authority, the voters, to find fault with nor cause uproar over, done so to merely keep his job. While that satisfies his self-interest and the citizens who don't like anything to interrupt the stillness of the waters, it is not a proactive or dynamic leadership which they and everyone else deserve, and which can lead to better things for the ultimate higher benefit of the community, that greater community which actual leadership should be bringing for everyone. Finally, I also believe he has his supporters in his quote-unquote style of representation, but ultimately it is a fairly low number in comparison to the amount of voters that actually exist. Apparently, Chris Rodriguez does well with the low percentage of voters who actually show up at the polls. This is not a mandate, but a shrugging, why not? I feel absolutely no passion from the population in regard to Chris Rodriguez as their representative. I've even found, in going door to door speaking to some citizens, that even some longtime citizens didn't know who their representative was or even his name after 16 years. That is an indictment on Councilman Rodriguez for failing to even show up at doors and introduce himself and chat with residents through the course of 3 U.S. presidents. It's time to elect a leader who will actually be there for you, show up, and show some spirit and care to do the job well. Dixon for Ward 1. Just for fun, here are the councilpersons with the best attendance records per year in the last 16 years. Number 1, Leslie LaCourte, Jim Graham, Cindy Stewart, Wes Cantor, Leo Knobloch, and Dan Miller, 0 absences. Number 2, Leslie LaCourte, Leo Knobloch, Karen Conason, Larry Morrison, Jim Graham, and Dan Miller, 1 absence. Number 3, Leslie LaCourte, Wes Cantor, Leo Knobloch, Karen Conason, 2 absences. Number 4, Leslie LaCourte, Leo Knobloch, Jim Graham, Larry Gilmore, 3 absences. Number 5, Councilpersons Gilmore and Potter, 5 absences. End of Part 2.